He stood on my porch and sang the same line of a Christmas song over and over until it stopped sounding like music and started sounding like a rhythm meant to mark time, my time, the house's time. I remember the porch light halo, the wet snow sticking to the welcome mat, and how each syllable landed like somebody counting the windows in my house. 4 terrifying true Christmas horror stories that will haunt you. I promise 4 real accounts, no fiction, no names added except where people already gave them, no false endings. These are things that turned ordinary holiday moments into something cold and dangerous. A carol that won't quit, a stranger at an arena, a tree lot with too many shadows, and a Santa who shouldn't have been on anyone's porch. I'm telling them in the first person because that's how they were lived. Small, ordinary people forced into a moment where nothing felt safe. I'll begin with the man on my porch. Story 1, The Porch Singer. I was home alone in a small house upstate. Snow had piled along the yard, and the TV murmured a forgotten sitcom in the other room. I had moved away from the city months before, thinking quiet would make everything softer. It didn't. Quiet makes every sound louder. It makes you hear the house settling. It makes you notice the scrunch of snow beyond the porch, the high note of wind in a bare maple. I heard the singing because at first it wasn't singing. It was a slow, off-key humming beneath the notes of a carol. I remember thinking it was kids walking by, some drunk neighbor with a Bluetooth speaker. Then the words became clear. Someone quietly singing a Christmas tune, exactly the melody of something everyone knows, but stretched and repeated so that it felt deliberate, like a metronome for someone else's breathing. I glanced at the window. There, on the porch, under the yellow halo of the light, a man stood, alone. He didn't have a car. He stood very still at the edge of the step and sang in that low, looping voice. When I opened the front door a crack and asked if he needed something, he didn't answer. He kept at the same line, his mouth moving slow as if memorizing syllables. He looked at me. No smile, no plea, just eyes that rested on me and then slid away to the yard. He asked nothing. He just sang, and the song filled the space between us like fog. I told him to leave. He walked off the porch without a word, down the driveway, taking the rhythm with him. I shut the door and flipped the deadbolt. I stood there with my back to the warm hallway, and I watched him through the curtains as he paused at the end of my drive, still singing. He stared at my house for a long time, then turned and walked down the street. I told myself it was over. People do strange things in winter. Maybe he had nowhere to be. Maybe he was drunk or lost or harmless. I made a sandwich, flicked the TV back on, and tried to make the sound of the house normal again. An hour later, I heard it again. This time, the sound came from the backyard, like someone humming beneath my bedroom window. I moved to the glass and pulled the curtains aside very slowly. There he was, standing below the dark rectangle of my room, just outside the fence. He was still singing the same line. This time he stopped and looked up directly at the window where he could see me. His voice softened, as if testing whether I changed my mind. Panic settles weirdly. It's not a sudden scream. It's a pressure behind the ribs, a coldness that crawls up your spine and tries to crawl in through the skin. I went to the phone. My hands were shaking so badly the numbers blurred. I called 911. When I whispered into the receiver, I remember focusing on the dissonance. My voice small in the phone, his voice steady in the dark below. The operator asked what we had, where we were. I told them. I told them the singing. I told them the man outside my house. The operator said police were en route. She asked if he was at the door. I couldn't say yes. I could only breathe and listen. Then the sound changed. The singing stopped, and there was a low animal exhale, like something that had been held in the chest for hours finally released. He screamed. The scream was a single raw noise that cracked the neighborhood quiet wide open. I watched him move with a speed that didn't fit the stillness he had carried all night. He ran to the back door and started pounding. Those knocks were different. They weren't the polite, half-hearted knocks of a lost house guest. They were fist-banging slams, sudden and heavy, as if he wanted to break wood in whatever protection it promised. I sank down on the landing, folded into myself with a baseball bat, because that's what you reach for when you're alone and stupidly trying to make some weight feel like safety, and I texted my sister. The pounding went on and on, a rhythm of panic. I could hear the bat whack against the closet door as I shoved it into the jacket behind me. My ears rang with each hit. Then, silence. A silence so complete it made the hair on my arm stand up. The kind of silence that comes after someone decides to stop. The police arrived a while later, lights and a soft clinical authority. They searched. They found prints in the snow, footprints that led from the driveway around the back of my property and into the nearby stand of trees. The officer who took my statement was careful with his words. He said they believed someone had been on the property and moved into the woods. He suggested we keep doors locked and stay with family if possible for the next few nights. I slept on my sister's couch that week. I told people the man had disappeared into the trees. That's true. I never saw him again. No arrest, no explanation. The police told me they had followed the footprints as far as they could with flashlights, and then the tracks broke into the deeper cover where prints fade into shadows. I went back to the house eventually. The porch light still hung with the same soft bulb. The welcome mat was still dull with salt stains. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. Every creak sounded like a step. Every shadow seemed to hold a silhouette. I started sleeping with the TV on. I started leaving the hall light burning. The holiday lights in my neighborhood, which I used to enjoy while driving home, now felt like eyes. The sound of a distant carol would make my stomach drop. I stopped answering the door to strangers. For months, sometimes years, I felt watched. Not threatened in a direct way. No one ever fought me on the street or tried to follow me into the grocery store, but watched like an animal being observed for too long. The song had been a claim, and though the man left before any real harm was done, that claim had altered the boundary of my life. A season later, I drove out of town for the holidays and didn't come back until spring. Even now, when winter rolls around and I see a person standing alone on a porch, my hands go cold. The house kept its walls. My sense of safety did not. He never needed to break a lock to change me. Story 2. The Arena Stranger. I grew up going to arena games. For my 6th birthday, we went, me, my parents, aunts, and uncles, and the place was everything a kid could want. Hot dogs, bouncing fans, foam fingers, the bright cheer of jerseys, and those high, echoing scoreboard noises. As a child, the arena is a cathedral of distraction. You get lost in the crowd on purpose. Anonymity is part of the fun. But there's another side to big gatherings. Someone can fold themselves into the roar and watch you like a seam in a fabric, not standing out until they decide to press. I was 6. I remember cotton candy, the plastic cup of soda, and the swell of cheer when the team scored. I remember standing in a wave of people, my small hand in my dad's. This man appeared near us in the stands, a tall white man who looked like he could cut through zones of people if he wanted to. At first, he seemed like anyone else at the game. A fan, maybe alone, maybe also celebrating. He was just there. He moved toward us. That's such a simple sentence, but it felt enormous in the moment. Someone closing distance when you're a child and trusting your parents are your buffer. He crouched down to my level and said something that sounded in the noise like he was trying to help, that he could show me where my parents were sitting. I thought nothing of it. I had been lost in a crowd once, and a nice man had helped me find my seats. But his eyes lingered longer than a helpful stranger should. He did not ask where my parents were. He offered to take me. I was small, so the thought expected none of the adult filters I would learn later. He grasped at the kindness a child affords naturally. He offered an easy solution. I remember the pulse in my throat when the idea of walking away with him slid into the room behind my ribs like cold water. I pulled away. I remember running because I had always been told to run to my parents if someone strange spoke in a way that felt off. I found my family. I told them. My voice was small and the place loud. My dad looked at me with irritation at first, like a small interruption. Then he looked over to where the man had been and down the aisles. There was a man there, but the crowd had folded around him and he was already gone, like he had never been in the same stretch of seats. The moment passed with the fluid indifference of an arena. The game continued, cheers rose and fell, and the man who had come close to me became nothing more than a vague shape in a memory. A week later, we were leaving the parking lot. My mom was at the wheel. I remember putting my head back against the seat and noticing how the stadium lights bled into the night sky. I saw a truck parked a little too close to our exit. A tall man stood beside it. He looked up at our car, looked straight at me, and then walked along the row as if looking for someone. The exactness of him standing there, like he had been waiting for the moment we came out, made my stomach drop. Mom locked the car doors. She told me to put on my seatbelt again, even though I had it on. We drove off. I felt watched the whole way home. That should have been all of it, the alert that nudges a person to say, get in the habit of looking behind you. But it wasn't. It bent towards something worse and more personal. Months later, one evening, I woke up to the beam of a flashlight across my bedroom wall. I sat up in my small bed, the covers twisting around my legs, and there it was, a pyramidal point of light, moving slowly on the blinds. My window looked out over the driveway. The beam slid across the curtains again and then fell directly on me, like a single finger pointed through the glass. I wanted to call out. Something in me stopped. I was 6, but not so small that I didn't know this was wrong. The light was deliberate. I remember the cold slickness of sweat on my palms as I eased my feet down, thinking to get to the hall and wake my parents. I moved the curtain with the tip of my finger and peered up. Just enough for the curtain to meet the light. There he was, a silhouette of a man just outside the glass, holding a flashlight, his body squared as if to read what the window gave him. I ducked away so hard my head hit the mattress. My parents came running. My dad checked the yard. The police came. They found footprints leading from the street to our window and back to the curb. No one was there when they arrived. They asked questions, they took a statement. After a while, people returned to their routines and the house learned to be nervous in different ways. My parents installed new locks. They stood at the windows looking like people who had discovered a small tear in the fabric of safety that had previously held everything together. At the time, my parents seemed skeptical about the first few things I said. Not uncaring, but distracted. There are explanations, there's logic, a child's memory is soft. I understand now what that feels like, the way a parent has to weigh the chance of frightening their child by acting like there's something to fear. But months later we found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of our family car. It was simple. It said, in a handwriting not nervous and not angry but oddly casual, a sentence that made me put my hands in my lap and not move them. That I would meet him again next New Year's. I don't remember the exact words anymore, only the way the letter sat on the paper like a promise or a plan. My mother read it and her face went flat. She called the police. The police took pictures, again told us to be careful. They took statements and dusted the car for prints. They said they would do what they could, but they also said something else, something less comforting. That there are people who find thrill in the attention of someone watching, in seeing how far they can reach without being caught. We moved seats at games. We started parking in busy, well-lit lots. I stopped going to a lot of games for years because the idea of crowds stretched me thin. too many entry points for someone to approach me again. The man never tried to take me on arena stairs. He never spoke my name in the grocery store. He did not escalate to physical contact. Still, the knowledge that he had come to my house, that he had shone a light into my room in the night, that he had left a note with the knowledge of where I lived, was a claim of a different kind. It meant vulnerability in front of a crowd, and vulnerability in the dark of the house where doors are supposed to mean safety. As I grew older, the memory hardened into a line of caution. I learned where to keep my phone, how to tell a parent about something that felt wrong without being dismissed. The note existed like an afterimage. Sometimes on quiet New Year's Eves, I would find myself checking locks and peeking out the curtains, waiting for something that never came. The police kept records. I don't know if this man was ever connected to other incidents. I know only what I felt. Less free, smaller sheltered, watching the edges of crowds more than I watched the game. A few years after the note, I stopped going even to other kinds of events. The ritual that once felt joyful now carried the weight of potential. I would look at stadiums differently, as if the architecture itself could be weaponized by someone who knows where light and shadow make places to hide. It never took anything from me but the idea of safety. Yet that is one of the most valuable things anyone can take. If this is beginning to sound like paranoia, believe me, I resented that label. But it's not paranoia when small things add up. A hand stretched to a child in the stands, the truck in the parking lot, the flashlight at the window, the note left on the windshield. Those pieces make a pattern, whether or not there was ever a criminal record to stitch them into a case. They add to a quiet dread that lingers in the chest long after who did it is gone. If this story feels like it ends at the note, know that the note was the point where the ordinary and the threatening crossed clearly. After that, my family treated the world differently around holidays. Curtains were kept drawn earlier and an extra lock went on the door. For a long time, I didn't tell friends the reason why I stopped going. It's hard to explain that your childhood memory of cheering and sugar suddenly carries a caution sign. If this is the kind of thing that makes you tighten a little when you walk into a crowded place, good. Be tight, be cautious. But also, if you ever had an odd encounter at a holiday event, someone who lingered too long, a note, a flashlight beam across your room, tell someone, share it, call it what it is. If this is speaking to you, leave your experience in the comments below. I want to hear what happened to you. The headlights of an SUV slide across the street, and somewhere a distant horn honks, an ordinary sound, and yet, in the frame of that note and that beam of light, a small thunder. Ambient shift, a thin, warped bell, then quieter crunch of snow underfoot. A title card slides in. Story 3. Story 3. The Tree Lot Ambush. We thought it would be simple. We always did. Picking a real tree had become our family ritual. Marianne, our son Andrew, and me. One of the few things that felt anchored and steady in the middle of December chaos. We packed the truck early, hoping to beat crowds and find a tree that leaned just so, one that looked like it belonged in our living room with stockings and a crooked star. The road up to the lot narrowed into a dirt track, the pines crowding in on both sides, until the world was only the truck's headlights and the dark green. There was a hush that smells like sap and cold. Breath fogged the cab, and Andrew kicked the back of my seat in the way only an excited kid can. The place we picked was the sort of operation that prides itself on being remote. Not a commercial lot with strings of lights and a guy with a chainsaw, but a small clearing off an old logging road where people cut a tree for the weekend and drove home smelling like resin. We parked, unloaded, and started walking in, the cold biting the exposed parts of our faces. The trail crunched under our boots like stiff paper. Marianne had a list of measurements. Andrew had a glove stuck in his pocket and a face that brightened at the idea of dragging a small forest home. We didn't expect eyes. We didn't expect a watchfulness that wasn't the curious glance of another family looking for a tree. We noticed him because he shouldn't have been there. A man in clothes that didn't match the weather, like he'd stepped into the snow from somewhere else. He was thin against the winter light, almost a silhouette, and he stood on the trail as if he had always been a part of it. His coat looked like it had been scoured by wind, too light for the cold, sleeves that didn't reach his wrists. He watched us without looking away, and when he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. It was a small thing, but it warmed nothing. At first, we shrugged it off. People are people. He might be lost or lonely or just as interested in trees as we were. But the way he kept pace, never striking into conversation, never close enough to be obviously shadowing, but always present at the widenings of the path, made a texture of unease run across my neck. He was always a step behind when we ducked into a hollow to examine a tree. When Mary Ann pointed out a branch and laughed, he didn't laugh. He only stood at the edge watching, like someone studying a map he wanted to memorize. We cut a tree that was more stubborn than it sounded. It took the three of us with a saw and a grunt to prise it free. Andrew hopped around, proud as a small general, and we strapped it to the roof. The drive back down the trail felt like a small victory. We were loud in the truck, warm against the cold. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the odd stranger had been left behind in the pines, and that would be the end of it. The day should have closed like that. Tree secured, laughter eased into the car's heater, the radio on low with some distant holiday station. We made it to the parking area. The lot had maybe a handful of other families, a scrap of conversation here and there, boots stomping. The truck's rear sagged with the weight of the tree. We unloaded. Mary Ann went to the trunk for rope. Andrew spun in a circle, trailing a scarf like a small flag. I swung my legs out and put my boots into the snow. The tires didn't make the sound we expected when we rolled toward the road. There was a soft hiss under the truck like a wind you can only hear in the ribs. I hopped down and bent over. Both rear tires were flat, torn neat enough that it didn't look accidental. Nothing dramatic, no jagged glass or a stick twisted through rubber, just the slow, impossible deflation of something that had been whole a minute before. We stood there, all three of us, in a triangle looking at the truck as if the damage could explain itself. Mary Ann's breath came out in short white bursts. Andrew's face drained of color. A man in a coat from another family had his phone out and was already calling someone. The first thing that arrived wasn't the police. It was a haze of complicated realizations. Someone had been on the lot after us. Someone had moved close enough to do this and then vanished back into the trees. I called the non-emergency police number because the lot was too far off the beaten path, and because we were all shaking so I couldn't trust what I said out loud. The officer on the other end told us they'd send someone, that we should stay with other people if we could. A neighbor from the lot suggested calling a tow truck, which we did, and someone else offered their jack and spare. I mentally cataloged the help around us like a ledger of safety. A dozen nearby strangers, 2 cars worth of witnesses, a phone full of numbers. But then the figures started to move at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just other families walking toward us to see what happened. The sunlight in that cut-through of trees threw long, thin shadows. But these shadows moved against the grain of the group. They came not as an approach from the road, but from the tree line, where trunks knit so close that a person becomes a suggestion rather than a person. A pair of shapes stepped into the clearing like men who had rehearsed their entrance. They didn't hurry. They didn't run. They moved with that slow economy that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand. One of them wore something that could have been a coat or could have been wrapped cloth. They didn't speak. They circled us at the outer ring, keeping a distance that felt intentionally calculated, close enough to see faces, but far enough to keep us from slowing them with a call. Their faces were unreadable in the dim. Andrew gripped my hand and didn't let go. The tow truck arrived with a kind of pragmatic brightness. men who work with jacks and belts and no time for stories. While they set up the lift, one of the tow guys waved a flashlight toward the tree line. You could see where a path had been trodden, where the snow had been broken into prints that moved like a story in the white. The officer who eventually arrived, he drove along a rut, lights on low, drew a flashlight across the edge and said, quietly, that the prints split, like someone had followed one trail and then the group had broken into multiple smaller ones that disappeared into the thicker brush. The officer took our statements. He spoke to us with a careful tone that never quite settled our building panic. His questions were the same he had asked elsewhere because he had to rule things in or out. He asked if we'd had any interactions before, if we'd seen anyone watching us too long, if someone had spoken to us, if we'd felt unsafe. I told him about the man on the trail. He nodded and made notes in a small book, and then explained with the patient distance of someone used to the frustration of partial answers. Remote lots have fewer cameras, fewer passerbys, and pathways where someone can slip into cover easily. He said they would walk the lines and ask others if they'd seen anything. He didn't promise more than that. We left the lot with a spare in the back of a stranger's SUV and the tow truck's number inside our phone. The man from the tow truck said, in a sort of blunt comfort, that they'd drive us to a gas station off the main road and let us rest. We drove slow because we wanted to see the tree against the night and measure how much of what made us a family the world could puncture in an odd, deliberate way. That night, we slept in the living room with the Christmas tree leaning against the far wall, needles refusing to lie quietly. Every creak sounded like someone stepping through the underbrush. Andrew woke several times, asking if the men had come back. Marianne and I watched the locks like people who had been given a small and finite power against the unknown. In the following days, people called to check on us. Some friends wondered if maybe it had been kids with a prank, or that a hunter had passed through, or that the tires had simply been old and given out. I kept thinking of the man on the trail, his indifference when we examined trees, the way the other figures had appeared not from the parking area, but from the dark fringe of the pines. It felt like being studied and then cataloged, the tree, the family, the time when we had chosen to linger. The police wrote an incident report. They took pictures of the tire and the prints in our statements. They looked along the paths and found that the tracks moved like a small broken braid into the woods, splitting and then stopping against the density of trunks. They said they'd passed the information along to other patrols that covered the area. That was true. That was everything that they said. No one called later to tell us they'd caught anyone. No one knocked on our door to say this pattern matched another. The missing link remained missing. We never made the trip back to that lot. We stopped going to untended spots with too perfect silence. The ritual itself changed. We bought a tree that was pre-cut at a well-lit market the next year, handed over money, and watched people who do this for a living put it in our truck. That felt like a small, sensible replacement. Andrew's laughter around a tree remained, but there was always a fissure in that joy now, an edge. When he asked years later why we hadn't returned to the place he used to call the woods, there wasn't a drama in my answer, only a quiet truth. We didn't like how it watched us, I told him. The hole left by the slashed tires wasn't about money or inconvenience. It was about the way the known world had been rearranged to accommodate the possibility of being observed. It made us check the backs of our cars, lock doors sooner, and feel a resistance to silence in places that used to be peaceful. For a long time, when Marianne drove up narrow country roads, I'd watch the tree lines tight, as if expecting someone to step out, slow and patient. We kept the pictures the officer had taken in a folder of documents. We would sometimes pull them out, paw prints in snow, the torn rubber flattened on the concrete at the tow yard, as proof to ourselves that the world had not only been glimpsed, but had been touched. And in the way that small, quiet violence settles into memory, the lot remained the place where something changed, where an ordinary family errand became a precise reminder that patterns can be designed to unsettle, to test boundaries that no one realized had been made so porous. Years later, if I drive by a stand of trees, my chest tightens in the same place it did when we sat on that snowy tailgate. I can still trace the arc of those footprints in my head, and sometimes at night I will wake hearing nothing, and yet I feel watched, as if the dark of the pines follows me home. We went for a tree and came back with a new habit. We refused to be alone in patches of quiet. The feeling of being observed stayed longer than any punctured tire. We never went back to that clearing. Story 4. The False Santa. When I tell people about this one, the image that seems to stick in their heads is the red suit. They hear Santa and their minds flick to the jolliness, the laugh, the kindness. That's why what happened felt so crooked, because the costume was the camouflage. I was 9. I remember a night lit by strings of bulbs along our street. The porch lights neighboring houses left pools of warmth. My mother had gone to the grocery with a list so long she had to fold it twice to fit it into her pocket. She told me she would be quick. She left the television on low and told me to lock the door and not open it for anyone. I remember that instruction because it's the one that stuck. We had decorated the living room with construction paper snowflakes, and I had a bowl of cookies on a coffee table too close to the edge because I had been eating them as I arranged the ornaments. The house smelled like cinnamon. The dog was asleep at my feet, a slow rumpety rhythm of breathing that made me feel like someone else was present, even though it was just the two of us. I was in that particular phase of being 9 where the world is mostly safe and mostly big at the same time. The idea that someone would knock felt impossible. The knock itself was peculiar. It wasn't a heavy pounding. It was 2 soft taps, polite, like someone not wanting to be a bother. I went to the peephole and looked through. A man in a Santa suit stood on the porch. The suit was serviceable. The beard looked slightly askew, like he'd adjusted it with gloved fingers. He held a small bag in one hand and a clipboard in the other, and his head was tilted slightly as if to hear me better through the glass. He smiled, and the smile looked like every Santa I had seen in a department store. From across the glass, the universe split into 2 directions. Everything I'd been taught, do not open the door to strangers, and the small kid-level wonder that someone dressed as Santa might have come to our house with gifts. He didn't shout or laugh the way you'd expect Santa to. He asked, in a medium voice that sounded practiced through a speaker, if a Mrs. our last name lived here, and then whether the little boy was home. My mouth felt dry and thick. I said nothing. I remember fumbling my hand into the pocket of my pajama top to get the phone. My fingers trembled as they found the numbers. The man on the porch cocked his head and said, "Are you home alone, little man?" as if asking a child's name in a game. He pressed the doorknob with the heel of his hand while he waited for an answer. You learn quick as a kid that adults will deal with strangers. The voice in my head that knows whether a situation is safe or not sent me a shock of adrenaline. I retreated behind the couch. The dog lifted his head and let out a short whine, then lowered it again. I could hear the man shifting his weight on the porch, as if testing the sounds of the house. I called my mother. I remember not wanting to whisper, because whispering makes things feel like secrets, and this wasn't meant to be a secret. The line between being brave and being safe is taught but rarely tested in childhood, and I had to decide which to be. I told her through my teeth that there was a man on our porch dressed like Santa. There was a pause. I could hear the rustle of her bag as if she was flipping a grocery list like someone choosing a way back home. She said the most ordinary thing. She would be right there. She hung up the phone, grabbed the keys, and left the grocery store in a hurry that sounded small on the other end of the line. The door had not opened. The man continued to shift and cock his head like someone listening for an answer that might be coaxed out. At some point, the man spoke louder, more deliberately. "Are you sure your mother is not home?" he asked through the door. "I just have a present for the little boy. Do you want to see?" He rattled something in his bag. The knocking came again, harder this time, a push against our boundary so that it wasn't merely a request, but an attempt to measure the response. The knob turned. It was not aggressive, it was experimental, a casual press to see whether a homeowner's resistance would ripple. It slid once, twice, and then a small click as if someone had checked. My heart was a panic drum. I crawled under the small table behind the couch and curled into a ball, because that seemed like what hiding was at 9, an attempt to make yourself smaller, less interesting. I heard my mother's footsteps on the sidewalk outside long before the front door opened. She stepped into the yard and immediately confronted the man. I don't remember all the words. What remains are fragments. Her voice sharp, asking what he was doing. The man's voice smooth, and an excuse formed like a practice line about charity and gifts. Neighbors looking out, drawn by the raised voices. My mother told him to leave, and he turned and walked down the street, not running, not hurried, just moving away like someone whose job had been interrupted. At some point, the man spoke louder, more deliberately. "Are you sure your mother is not home?" he asked through the door. "I just have a present for the little boy. Do you want to see?" He rattled something in his bag. The knocking came again, harder this time, a push against our boundary so that it wasn't merely a request but an attempt to measure the response. The knob turned. It was not aggressive, it was experimental, a casual press to see whether a homeowner's resistance would ripple. It slid once, twice, and then a small click as if someone had checked. My heart was a panic drum. I crawled under the small table behind the couch and curled into a ball because that seemed like what hiding was at 9, an attempt to make yourself smaller, less interesting. I heard my mother's footsteps on the sidewalk outside long before the front door opened. She stepped into the yard and immediately confronted the man. I don't remember all the words. What remains are fragments. Her voice sharp, asking what he was doing. The man's voice smooth, and an excuse formed like a practice line about charity and gifts. Neighbors looking out, drawn by the raised voices. My mother told him to leave, and he turned and walked down the street, not running, not hurried, just moving away like someone whose job had been interrupted.
The police came after, as happens with these things. Someone had called from a neighbor's house, and they took statements. They told us this wasn't the first report they'd had of a person in a costume going door to door in the area asking if children were home. The word suspicious was used a lot. It covered the breadth of what they'd seen without giving the specifics that make radio signage for a man. They dusted for prints as if a Santa suit could leave one's behind in the snow the same way a sleigh might. Neighbors compared notes, and someone said they had seen a similar figure a few nights earlier at another house 2 blocks over. I was praised for not opening the door. Someone held me like that was the victory. It was the right decision, and I felt proud, but there was something else in the mix, an image I couldn't scrub out. I could see the man's face beneath the beard for a blink, and there was a look that didn't belong to a holiday helper. It was an empirical kind of wrongness, calculated, curious, deliberately benign in the costume, but not in the intent. He had tested us. He had pushed the knob. He had imagined what it would be like if the house were empty and what he could do with that moment. Neighbors told other neighbors, and the street that had been gentle with lights and small talk turned a little watchful. Door chains were used more often. Extra locks appeared. My mother began to ask for the last time she would leave me alone. She never stopped trusting me, but she didn't trust that the world was always full of kindly costumed strangers. The Santa figure became a horizon in our life, an emblem of the way a familiar face might be made unfamiliar in its purpose. As I grew older, the memory of that night stayed with me like pebbles in my pockets. I would sometimes trace my thumb along the peephole and remember the Santa's head tilted, the bag at his side, the casual press of the knob. It made me look differently at people who wore uniforms or costumes around children, at anyone who seemed to use cultural symbols to slide past distrust. The man in the suit never returned to our porch, at least not in a way we could confirm. But the possibility that someone had walked the street again, testing doors and reading the rhythms of houses, tightened something inside of me. I watched Santas differently at parades and mall photo ops. There was always a moment where I would study the man behind the beard, not amused but wary for an instant. Neighbors eventually settled into their new habits. The man in the Santa suit remained a story in our block's low-traffic winter talk, a strange thing that had rattled a small community into being a little more careful. But for me, for years after, every time I saw Santa on a porch, it wasn't automatically a sign of cheer. It was also an indicator of where trust could be misused and how easily a costume can be a mask for intent.
I'll never forget sitting behind the couch with the dog's warm breath against my ankle, hearing the knob creak as if someone were testing the house like you test a gate to see whether a child would open it. The memory is small and domestic, and it keeps its teeth. I didn't open the door. Closing, the resting cold. There's a common thread in all of these stories that is easy to miss until you walk back through them. The theater of ordinary things becoming instruments of discomfort. A song meant for joy becomes a loop of attention. A stadium crowd becomes an opaque theater where someone can slip into the seams. A kind forest turns into a place that watches. A Santa suit is pressed into service as a testing of boundaries. Each one is a small corrosion of norms, a way for a predator to practice crossing lines that we thought were solid. The people in these stories were ordinary, parents, kids, neighbors, doing normal things on calendar days we all recognize as safe, as warm. That ordinary is what makes the intrusion feel so intimate. The perpetrators, where they appear, are often unremarkable. They use distance or costume or the din of a crowd to compress the space between observation and action. They do not always escalate to visible violence. Their power often comes from the fact that they were never seen until they wanted to be, and then disappeared when they were done testing. None of these stories conclude with tidy consequences. Police came, statements were taken, evidence was looked at and then set aside. In each case, the most enduring outcome wasn't a court file. It was a recalibration of how people moved in the world around the holidays. They closed their curtains earlier. They left crowded places sooner. They asked follow-up questions that had not seemed necessary before. The violence done is not always flesh and blood. It is the slow theft of an untroubled night. If you take anything from these accounts, it's not a checklist of fear, but a recognition that vigilance is not paranoia when there are patterns. These experiences leave marks that are quiet but persistent. They change the way a person walks into a room, the way a parent watches a child at a game, the way a family approaches what used to be a small, harmless tradition. If any of these stories resonated with you, if you have a strange holiday encounter that left you cold in the same way, share it below. Tell us what you felt, when you felt it. These are the nights that teach us how to look out for one another, and the more we acknowledge them, the less alone those small, sharp memories become. If these stories chilled you, subscribe for more true accounts of unsettling nights, and share this video with someone who should hear it. And if you have one of your own, leave it in the comments. We read them. He stood on my porch and sang the same line until the music stopped meaning anything at all, and the sound of that night follows me whenever the snow falls.
Warped single bell note lingers, then silence.